right, then we'll get started. It's not a...
That is not.
Fine, there's no one to sit there. Okay, that's fine. We'll get started.
I'm here.
Cool. Right, so I'm doing a workshop on how to use spec examples and empirical analysis. This workshop is not a couple of things. Firstly, it's not what spec is or how to get spec. How to get spec is, firstly, listen to Wadan's workshop. Secondly, listen to Adam's workshop. They talk a lot about how to gain spec. Thirdly, come to the workshop series, because a lot of them are just spec. So you get to learn technical knowledge about all these things. Other advice I have is just read and do those kinds of things. You know, like I'm not going to teach you how to do that. The second thing is I'm not going to tell you, so the idea of this workshop and the thesis of it is how to weaponize spec in a way that is good in a debate, not just like what kind of spec gets and doesn't get credited. That's in the manual. If you want to read it, you can. Ideally, this workshop should take you towards a point where you can be comfortable using basically anything you know about the world in the debate, either as an example or as spec knowledge, which is something that's good to say now we're waiting for. Cool, let's get started. Firstly, I'm coming back to this. We talked about it last time I did a workshop, but we talked a lot about this one. This is basically, for those of you that weren't here or don't remember, just a list of things that count as a mechanism via both the most recent EUDC manual and also now the most recent WEDC manual. I think like there was never a change in any of this. So things that count as a mech. A mech, moral intuitions, like rebuttal or a flip, and then just like emotive responses that are stylistic. Notice the first one is literally empirical evidence. Like this is the first criteria that we are told, or ideally that we are told to credit in debating as a persuasive thing to add to your claim. So now you might be asking, like, why is my spec not being credited? Well, let me tell you. Why is this difficult? So the first thing is structural reasons. These are becoming popular. And what a structural reason basically is well, ideally what it's supposed to be is that it is the intrinsic reason behind why something is true, but down to like the most structural root of what the problem is. And or what the solution is. So, you know, like rather than talking about empirical things that may exist in the world, you might use more granular knowledge or more granular language to talk about these groups within the first place. Often it is seen as more persuasive insofar as the second thing, resurgence of logically prior, it is seen as prior to the spec knowledge that exists, i.e. the spec knowledge to be analogous and or the spec knowledge to be important in the debate. You analyze why the actors will always engage in this kind of behavior that often comes through structural reasons. So often these are just credited significantly further than what your spec knowledge might be credited for. Those are the first two reasons. The third thing, like kind of incongruous with these, is often empirical reasons are actually just like less persuasive than structural reasons. Often they are just less persuasive than a lot of the other mechanisms that we necessarily talked about. And I think this is something that people tend to complain about when they drop spec and it doesn't get credited to the degree. They're like, oh, this chair is dumb, they don't know the spec. Maybe, but also maybe you drop your spec in a really shit way, you didn't analyze it, like you did it really badly. Notice it's probably more persuasive if you're able to supplement one with the other and things like that. This is an unfortunate thing, but most adjudicators are actually dumber than the AIB, because most adjudicators, but that's true, most of us actually don't read like every newspaper ever and the headlines of it. Most of us are not global, we're actually based, like most of us based in the West. Most adjudicators overall are based in the knowledge, the zeitgeist that they're in, things like this. So it means they actually don't know a lot of spec. There's a couple of issues with this. Firstly, though they are supposed to be willing to be persuaded, they don't want to be that guy, that credited spec that is actually wrong. So then they're like, I'm going to err to the side of caution, and obviously I have to deliver an oral adjudication to all teams. So if the spec is wrong, then like I look like an idiot if I credited it, so I'm not going to credit it. So it is often way more effective to just explain these kinds of spec. Again, I'm going to get into this. The fifth thing is spec and empirics are hard to analogize. We'll talk about this. I.e., often with spec knowledge or examples or things like that, you have to prove why it is analogous for it to be the most persuasive it can. The sixth thing is that spec can often be really confusing, and this is related to debaters just delivering spec in a really bad way. So this means that a lot of the details within spec are often just lost in translation. This is very common in finance and economics debates. So make sure that you're writing it in something that is realistic. But again, we'll talk about this. Okay, what we will cover, the stuff that I said at the start. Okay, so what is the thesis of this? So basically, I do think it is really, really important to have examples, spec, and empirical analysis at your beck and call, and also as something that you're very comfortable using in a good way in order to do well in debating. And I know a lot of what we tell people when they join BP is like, this is a wonderful, beautiful sport wherein you don't need any specialist knowledge. Wherein you don't need any specialist knowledge in order to do well and things like that. And that is true to a certain extent. On a lot of motions, you really don't need any specialist knowledge. A lot of motions are pretty simple in what they talk about. It's then just about how successfully you're able to be persuasive within the realms of that motion. But I do think there are certain scenarios in which if you really, really want to advance in debating, being able to weaponize spec and being able to weaponize your special knowledge and what you know is something really important. So firstly, it's in top rooms, and I'll go into this in a second, but even in debates with kind of stock motions and things like that, often top rooms are just won by the team that are the most realistic in the real world. And Adam would have talked about this in his workshop as well. And the reason that you're better able to do this with spec knowledge and or you're better able to do this with examples is that often you'll give analytical chains that are nebulous and maybe exist in the conditions of this motion. But if you're unable to persuade the judge that they exist in the real world, then other teams that are able to analogize these to make it look like it exists in the real world, i.e. they are just more illustrative, are likely to do better in this room. Often in top rooms, teams have fulfilled all of their burdens, they've done all the weighing they need to do, they've done really good rebuttal, they've done things really, really well, so often it just then comes down to what is most persuasive and what's most granularly persuasive. The second thing is technical motions. This is very obvious. You need spec and technical motions, because in top rooms people will know spec about these technical motions and you won't, so you look like an idiot. Third thing is sounding knowledgeable. And this is quite obvious. If you know about the world, sound like you know more about the world. This is what Tom was talking about last week, or 2 weeks ago, which is that you just start winning on vibes a little bit more. You just seem like you know more. And this is quite important, especially when you're getting better and better. Often winning rooms on vibes is just how you win. Yeah, they're better. Examples. Cool. Illustration. And what illustration is. So I'm going to be real with examples. You probably won't ever win a debate by just using examples. This is probably not a thing that's ever going to happen. But often you will win debates by using the correct examples to supplement the correct types of analysis. So when I talk about illustration, what I mean is just making your arguments more real. And often this is kind of hard to quantify, right? Because sometimes it's just we're down saying things like, these are real people, guys. And I but seriously, often, and we will go into this, is that in debates there are a lot of stock nouns that are used, things like investors, things like raw materials, things like counter narratives and things like that, which are really, really non-specific. And even if it is the case that picking one example is just one pluck off of many things that exist in the realm that you're talking about, it's good to be specific on at least one of these, insofar as you're at least grounding your analysis, even if it is just real people, tell me who these real people are. So basically what you're trying to do is make groups where people feel more real. Question, I am going to explain a lot of this. Question. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so first illustration. So what I was talking about earlier is often teams defer to very nebulous, non-specific language. And the reason that they do this is because of this narrative we're told, right? It's you don't need any specialist knowledge to win debates. And often these terms, to be fair to them, are quite efficient insofar as they're very broad stroke. So you talk about the majority of the actors that are engaging in a certain type of action. So for example, if I say something like investors pull out, it just means that probably there's a large swathe of investors that are pulling out. But ideally, you want to be specific at least once, for the reason that I was saying earlier, right? Because if you're more illustrative, that is when you are at least showing to the judge that you're defending a stance which is more grounded in reality and what's going on. Again, this is just more important as we go forward. So if you look at these two examples, you can pick any Bangladesh motion that was said over the past few weeks. So, for example, if we're trying to defend a world wherein the Awami League does still exist and we're not handing over the plate to other extremist parties that could exist, you could say something like more political instability leads to investors and MNCs pulling out due to, I meant more speculative markets, or less speculative markets around you, meaning that you end up getting less money. And this is fair. You said money, you said investors, you said speculative, and these are probably a way in which investors interact with speculative or non-speculative markets and then decide where to pour their money, or things like that. Notice, I think this analytical chain is actually just really not that dissimilar from that analytical chain. But something about it sounds more persuasive, especially in the context of the debate, because you suddenly know who the party is. You suddenly know what the industries are in Bangladesh that investors could pull out of, and what the industries that are developing around the region could also be similar to Bangladesh in. And then you say which state is actually getting poorer. Notice, it actually didn't do anything meaningfully more analytical than what is said at the top. And for example, if that was opening opposition, that was closing opposition, and you were opening opposition, and you lost that closing opposition, you would be pretty pissed off. But I do think in the context of the debate, you should probably just be deferring to doing the second thing in the first place. Demonstrating what your knowledge is, and using the examples of the types of like industries, or using the examples of whatever the hell you know, if it is more efficient than saying what the first thing is, such as political instability and things like that. That's just one way to illustrate. However, I know what you're going to say. You're going to be like, but Aymaan, sometimes the motion is non-specific. I'm like, yes, I know. But, but I think you can still weaponize illustration in very non-specific motions in a way that is beneficial to you. Notably, in technical motions like that, or in specific motions, obviously the prompt is to literally use spec. If you don't use spec, then you do sound more unpersuasive like that. And the reason is that you're less attuned to the motion. So I think it's fair to say, so I feel like that could be a thing that a judge might say, why closing opposition means opening opposition. It would kind of be bullshit, but like, I would see it. But notably, on non-specific motions, I think you can still weaponize past examples and spec on structural analysis that already exists. So, for example, in debates about whether ISDS should exist, or in debates about whether countries or companies should be able to sue each other based on things that are happening. Notice, you can do analysis such as countries often lose when they're taken to court, because businesses often have more powerful lawyers, they have more money to pour into the case than in the first place. I think if you were to get rid of this, then this is firstly more vulnerable, but secondly, it is hard to ground whether this is actually true. Because the thing is in the mind of the judge, when you are defending a stance, the burden on you is to defend that in all cases, or in the majority of cases, your actor is going to interact in the way that it does. And often the barrier to that thing happening is the judge asking, is this thing provable based on every other instance that could exist in the world, or every other counterforce that could exist in the world? Notably, your opposition team might never push back against all the counterforces to this happening. They might not ever tell you that this is kind of empirically untrue. Most of the time the countries do actually win, 42% of the time they do. But notice, the judge is still going to be like, well, the burden is on them to say that it powers through all of whatever the nebulous counter forces could necessarily be. I do think this is an implicit thing that judges do. So notably, when you add in this example, for example, Occidental oil versus Ecuador, and Occidental just had institutional knowledge about what voiding of contracts is like in international, and also in Ecuadorian law. So this meant that Ecuador ended up losing. Even if it is the case that 42% of the time, countries are actually the ones that are able to win these sorts of cases. What this example proves is that there was a specific case where there was more institutional knowledge about the law and more powerful lawyers, which meant that people were able to push that through and meant that this case was able to be won. So notably, then that eases the mind of the judge a little bit more on crediting a case that is more speculative and things like that. We're down. Do you have a question now?
No.
Yes.
How do you avoid getting, I think I would call it getting caught up in the example, where you maybe all of your analysis does apply to quite a lot of examples, but you use one example and maybe you use it more than once, and then judges get caught up in that example as well, and they begin to believe, and the rest of the round begins to believe that this is the only case in which your analysis applies.
Okay. So the first thing is your phraseology and just how you deal with it. So if you use an example and even if you keep coming back to that example, I think it is useful to literally say, the reason this is analogous to my analysis or my previous analysis, just so you signpost it a lot. Because if you signpost your previous structural analysis, then that is the thing that the judge will try and forefront credit as opposed to just your example. Often it is kind of hard to not get your example kicked around by the rest of the teams. And the reason, but the reason for this is quite simple, right? Rather than teams picking up nebulous intrinsic links that are in your cases, they'll pick up on the example and they'll just say why it's not analogous or things like that. I think the first thing to make yourself resistant to this is just make sure you flag your surrounding analysis as well as possible. So even if your example does get kicked to the ground, it's like at least the actors that you say are probably likely to interact in the ways that you say. I think the second thing is that well, maybe that's a good thing, right? Because then your example gets beat up, but the rest of your analysis doesn't. But the other thing is that if you drop an example that is maybe likely to get kicked around in a certain way, I think you should apply contingencies to it, to your case earlier. And this is not the same as analogizing it to your case. So that is to say that you highlight in the example that if an opposition team wants to say that this doesn't happen, the burden is on them to do X, Y, Z, which means that opposition teams also get more scared to just bash your example because they realize it is more intrinsic to your analysis in and of itself. So it depends on the strategy you take, whether you want to make it as inextricable or extricable from your structural analysis. Just depends on that strategy. I think these are things that you can do. Fantastic. We're going to go into a game which is called Give Me an Example. So the premise that you guys are analyzing is when universities are more poorly managed and or they have less money, they cut funding for good initiatives. I want you guys to think for like a couple of minutes of an example of literally anything that could be related to this premise. I'm going to ask every single one of you for a response. 2 minutes. Think about it. You can talk amongst each other. I don't care.
I've got an example, but I don't want you guys to have it, so.
Are we going to get asked like an example each, or?
Yes.
No, I'm really. You know I panic every time this happens.
Yeah, we're not favorite thing is just like make up shit that sounds good.
Yeah. I would definitely prefer the first. If you want to do the second, that's fine too.
That's just what illustrated, right?
Does Peter Matheson taking a 5% pay raise constituting 20,000 pounds and then immediately announcing budget cuts apply?
Literally anything that's related to the premise. I'm not gonna be like, guys, it's a shit example. Like the purpose of this is to highlight something.
Am I allowed to Google to check that the thing that I'm about to reference is actually true?
Yeah, give me a source, man.
No, just pretend it's true. Like just say it with your gut and say it's true. That's what you need. Okay, so.
Back in my day.
Okay, let's get started. Adam.
Okay, example is that, for example, in many like Central European countries, currently universities are really like underfunded, which means that simply they do not give enough money to like the PhD students, which means the PhD students basically work on just an amount of money that is just slightly more above the minimum wage.
Fantastic. Moving.
All super top elite universities that have good management and lots of money, like Harvard or Oxford, have 1 million student societies that allow students to like explore their interests.
Right.
When Johns Hopkins University overinvested in a new student center as well as a private police force, they now lack the funding to supply adequate housing for all of their students.
Fair enough.
Like when Edinburgh Uni stops having, or like doesn't have enough money to be able to pay tutors, then they just don't raise their wages as much, and then those tutors end up going on strike, and that causes lots of problems for students that need them to be able to mark their work.
In a lot of, I guess it's generally across the UK, when you don't have enough money going into work experience opportunities, so for example, at Royal Holloway you had less opportunities for history students to explore their career interests as opposed to STEM students, like computer science students, who had more avenues and more connections and more money invested into that.
Tom.
Have you guys ever been to 7 George Square? Dude, that toilet is always fucking full. Clogging that shit.
7 George Square?
Like the psychology building.
We're done.
As a result of Britain leaving the EU, the number of international students that are coming into the UK have like halved, which has meant that universities, as a result, are having to lay off staff or increase prices, which is like leading to possibly Scottish University not being free anymore.
Eli.
As a result of the messaging the UK has been doing to discourage international students from coming, they've gotten fewer international students as well, which has resulted in them having less money, which has resulted in them cutting a significant number of language courses, including modern languages, which has then made UK students less employable internationally.
Wonderful. Tristan. What did you look up? What's your source?
Okay, so this is actually just jumping off what Eli said, but specifically in December of 2023, the University of Aberdeen cut language courses, particularly those to do with like French, Gaelic, and so on.
Fantastic. Okay.
So despite the ongoing UK mental health crisis and the fact that these resources are more in demand, the university is now only offering 4 sessions of free counselling when they used to offer 6, so a third reduction, just because they don't have enough people.
Yeah. Ruby.
Rensselaer Polytechnic and a whole bunch of other polytechnics were like, yeah guys, we're gonna have to slash your art programs because actually STEM needs cooler buildings.
Which
shit sucked.
Housing crises in various universities because the universities don't invest in housing.
Yeah, right.
Lancaster Uni got a fight with this bus company, which essentially means that for everyone who lives in the town, they get less students who live on the campus, going to the businesses, and for all the students who live in the town, they can't go to campuses either.
Look at it.
I'm going to assume this counts, but in South Africa,
Oh no.
the mismanagement of public funding for universities has led to a lot of things like technicons and all of that, which allow other people to get traditional degrees have closed down, which has severely impacted the job market and led to climbs in unemployment.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, well, as part of cost-cutting measures, a lot of UK universities have reduced the amount of tutors they have, but while being forced to keep the same amount of students, so the class sizes increase, reducing the quality of education that people get.
Fantastic. There's a couple of things that, well, go ahead.
I just have a question.
Yes.
I understand that a lot of these examples have inbuilt mechanization into them, which meant that they were beneficial just in terms of mechanizing. But in terms of actually illustrating, is there any meaningful difference from someone saying Edinburgh University did this, and when universities have less money, this means they don't have stuff like bursaries or outreach programs anymore? I feel like the latter could equally be as illustrative enough for the judge to credit it for you. What is the unique benefit of bringing in an example that does the thing which yields?
No, I just think you're right. I think it's all the things that I was saying earlier. So you sound more knowledgeable, things like that. I also think it's as your course sort of thing, where it's yeah, maybe you're right, but sounding like you're sounding more knowledgeable and being able to ground it more in something that is more real probably isn't as much cost to you, because the analysis is probably equally as creditable, especially if you do the same underlying analysis as you just said. So considering this example, you could be for example, I know Edinburgh Uni did this, literally probably takes 7 seconds out of your speech at most, but it then fights off that internal barrier the judge has in their head, which is maybe all of the things that it's saying are true, but is there a reason to believe that it's not true? There's less of that if it's definitely happened in the real world. And go.
How to you make some mechanism for such impact? If the judge basically has not ever heard of it, but it's relatively important. For example, with this motion, many countries have problem with basically on universities allocating money based on something which is called the coefficient of difficulty, which basically really underfunds humanities, which means that basically the humanities professors do not have, for example, have lower wages than I don't know, primary school teachers. And the problem is that I assume that many judges simply have never heard of it, and therefore might simply not credit it in their head that as much as problem. So how to
I have a whole section on how to make judges believe your spec. So I will get onto it in that section, and then
So some people sometimes do anecdotal examples.
Yes.
Is there a way to make those work?
Sure, fine.
Yeah.
You just say I don't know, I guess it's.
I'd use it as an introduction.
Yeah.
Rather than an emotive introduction of when I was blah 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 whatever, and you be this is the problem. This is the case.
Well, we're not lying now, but that's the answer.
Yeah,
But okay, so there were a couple of things that are really good about this. I think the first thing is that people explain their examples really, really well. So me as a judge, in response to what Adam's question was, somewhat, but I will go on to it more, is that I'm more willing to buy spec insofar as you're willing to explain it a little bit more to me. Because the average informed voter, most judges do, I really hope know this, is that yes, you do know the headlines, but you're willing to be persuaded by certain things. So insofar as it is told to you in a way that is analytical and in a way that it is persuasive, then that is good. The second thing, and this is more important, is the purpose of this exercise was that I think this is a really, really broad premise, and this could have a lot of motions that makes you end up arguing this, which is that universities end up with less money or universities end up with worse management. So for example, it could be this house believes that staff should elect university officers. It could be something like this house believes that the collegiate university system is better than the centralized university system. It could literally be any of these motions. Notably, every example that you guys said is probably cross-applicable in the sense of illustration. So for example, it might not be a Brexit motion. It might just be a different motion about a different group of universities being gutted of funding. But obviously the downstream impact of that is just based on this premise. So for example, even if it is some random fucking uni in South America or some shit, where you're arguing this kind of premise, you can be I know for certain that when Brexit made international students not come to university in the United Kingdom, there was a certainty to which universities were gutted of funding. in the same way that it could happen in these universities if they don't promote to international students, etc. So being able to analogize and being able to bring in illustrative examples from places that you know just makes it more convincing when you say that a certain actor is going to bleed or going to benefit in a certain way. That was the main thing. So all of these things are kind of cross-applicable, irrespective of motion, irrespective of thing. So the important thing with this is that when you are motion prepping, when you're doing your prep with your partner, and or you're approaching a certain motion, I wouldn't rule out using examples to be illustrative just after seeing the motion. Because often people will be like, oh, this motion is comparative in this way, and the spec I have on this is probably irrelevant, or the topical spec. But it could be that it is more illustrative of a claim that you have. So rather, I would plan your examples around the premises that you argue, as opposed to the motion that occurs. If it is a technical motion, obviously plan your spec around the technical motion, because you need your spec on that one. But if it is a less technical motion, like if it's something like this house believes that universities should elect their officials, then yeah, do it by premise. It's probably a good thing. Right. Second exercise, we're going to do the flip, which is give me something to illustrate with this. So I'm going to give you an example, and you're going to talk about the things that could link to this or could be well illustrated by this. The thing is, the example is, in 2016, a candidate called D's Nuts entered the presidential election and polled at 5% in North Carolina before being pulled from the race for being too young. Think about it for like a minute. And then
What we did? Sorry.
the inverse of what we just did. So this is the example.
Yeah.
Find a premise, find a stock premise,
Find a premise.
which could be well illustrated by this, or any element of
Okay.
this.
Oh god.
I use this in one of my A-level politics essays. Alright, we're going to reverse order. Matt.
Clue.
Tom.
It's like evidence that lots of people are disenfranchised because if they're not voting for a candidate who's suggesting real policies, then they'll vote for some like random person to protest. So you already know that like 5% of people are really unhappy with the political state of the USA.
Word up.
The power that comedy and like doing stuff for the bit has for people, and the extent to which people are willing to do stuff just to appear to be funny or uphold like their inner or get respect within their inner circle.
Matt, you ready?
Yeah, comedic politicians can take away votes from actual serious politicians, so people vote against their interests by doing people like this.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of a similar thing, but I think it just speaks to the extent to which people are disillusioned with who should be the rational choices within a given political system.
Right.
I think this is a good illustration of how memes are actually a good impact on society, because personally, when I read this example, I chuckled.
Fair enough. So, yeah.
Level of political apathy and people willing to, like, even if they go to the polling station, they will vote for someone that isn't an actual candidate because they don't care about the actual policies.
Ruby.
Young people not being able to engage in the political system as well, because there's 5% voting for them, and also then they were not able to actually go anywhere because they were too young. So.
Kate.
Political satire is unethical because it has an opportunity cost and people will actually vote for crazy candidates like these nuts.
I was also going to do the young people are probably disenfranchised. I would just add to that it should be fairly intuitive, but like probably most old people are not familiar enough with the meme to be voting for somebody called these nuts. So like if it was necessary to illustrate like specifically why this would pertain to young people, that would probably be the mechanism.
Eli.
It's important for people to know the rules of the state that they live in and their rights within these states so they can engage in the system in a legitimate way.
It's kind of tying into what other people have said, but there is a rise, it shows that there's a rise of unserious culture which is bleeding out beyond social media and is therefore affecting how generations are engaging with more serious matters, and so this can be good, this can be bad, but it's something that's present at least in society.
Yeah.
This is just a bit of nuancing, but North Carolina is a swing state, so having this like uniquely happen there is probably really bad insofar as 5% is actually quite a big margin of people when it comes to swings that are like states that are on the margins of winning for candidates.
Right.
Political institutions, even when faced with significant disillusionment, have existing mechanisms for overcoming that disillusionment and replicating themselves.
Yeah, that was the first premise that I thought of. Well done, right? Dude.
I would also say something similar to what has already been said. So maybe that young people don't really have a chance to engage in the political system in a meaningful way, even if they have considerable support.
To be a bit different, I think it illustrates that lots of political freedom, the fact that these nuts was fine and being too young is the issue.
But this illustrates that many people have so-called substitution effect, which means that basically when they are supposed to answer some complicated question, they instead automatically shift to answering a more simplistic question like, do I like the candidate's name, instead of deciding based on the policies.
Yeah, fantastic. So notice we had a really big range of premises that were illustrated by this example. And I don't know if any of you did A-level politics. I know my teacher banged on and on about examples. So he was like, you need to have examples, otherwise you're gonna fail. I was like, fair enough. You were literally capped at a 12 out of 30 if you didn't use examples, even if you had all the structural reasons. And I think this is a good way of illustrating it, insofar as the tactic for me in that scenario became, I'm going to find the examples that are the most broad stroke, as opposed to just revise a fuck ton of examples. So it meant that I looked for examples that could cross-apply to a lot of different arguments that I would have over a bunch of different topics, just to make sure I was being most efficient. So notice here, we talked about the efficiency/inefficiency of the US political system, the enfranchisement or the disenfranchisement of the young and the people in general, the satirism and the comedy involved with politics, comedy in general, politics in general. There are so many premises that you can analyze just with anything that you know about the world. So I think it is not a big ask just to be able to do examples or illustrate with examples in the first place. And the ask that I'm doing to all of you guys is basically to think about it in the right way. And often people just get stumped. They're like, shit, I can't think of an example. I think the first thing is just, don't worry if it's not too technical, like what Wedan was saying. Just make sure that it is something that is grounded in the real world. And something that you know about, something to demonstrate your knowledge in debates. And the second thing, which is what we were talking about earlier, with the last thing, which is just be as strategic with it as possible and stuff. Fantastic. We're going to move on to spec and empirical analysis. This is just advice that I did on illustration. I will say it's often not as necessary as a lot of the other things like Wedan's and Adam's workshops on how to win debates, but I do think it will be the tipping point to you in many top rooms. Eli knows very well. Spec and empirical analysis and how to do this. So I'm going to break this up into two things. Firstly, defensive strategies, and secondly, offensive strategies when it comes to how to weaponize spec and how to weaponize empirical analysis and empirics that you know about the world. Defensive strategies are more just not last ditch, not desperate, but you'll see. Just things that you can say in your speeches to make the judge buy your spec if you don't have any analysis with spec in the first place. Offensive strategies are actual dividends that you should do. The first one on defense is often if you are doing empirical analysis, you will just kind of empirically be on the back foot. And the reason for this is what Adam was saying a few workshops ago, which is that often if you are dropping empirical analysis, it is that you are in contrary to the structural reasons that are happening in the debate, and you are trying to come up with a real-world example of why the thing doesn't happen in the first place. So, unfortunately, Esme is not here, she would love this, but think about the bilateral trade agreements that she was talking about last week. Obviously, the response to this is, structurally, this makes no sense. Why would a country ever engage with those kinds of agreements? If they are that pernicious and that coercive, and make you pay out that much money, it's obviously just an awful idea to go into these things in the first place. And you'll get some dickhead team being like, countries aren't dumb, bro. Why are you saying developing states are dumb? Fuck you. Right? But obviously, bilateral trade agreements do empirically exist, and they are pretty widespread throughout the world, and they are pretty pernicious for all the reasons that Esme was talking about last week. So often, when you are saying this, and me just saying that now, it does sound a little bit desperate. I'm like, but they exist, bro. What are you talking about? So that's the first note. Often, you will just kind of be on the back foot when you're doing defense. There's a few things you can do here. Firstly, you just tell the panel, this is just true. Or you tell the panel, this is just empirically true. You say something like, this is a fact about the world. This means that the judge is more inclined to at least think about whether it is a fact or not. Or often, and this is more important, is given the resurgence of structural reasons, often judges are kind of waiting for an explanation with spec. Like, you drop a piece of spec that you know, or you drop like something that you empirically just know about the world, and then the judge is like sitting there waiting, like, okay, explain this. But all you're going to do is drop the fact, because how are you going to explain this fact, for example? So, like, an example of this is, in a round I was judging, one of the teams was just like, Korea has mandatory national service. And then, like, in my panel discussion, one of them was like, he didn't explain this. But then the person said, it's just a fact. And if you think about it, I don't know how much more deductive than that you can be, because it's just a thing that exists. So often you can just say that, I don't have any further explanation than this. This is just something that is empirically true. It is as structural as any structural reason, because it is just a thing that is baseline true. The second thing is you can be kind of offensive in your defense. You can be like, I know you guys say, or would say, that I asserted this, because like sometimes when you drop spec, judges are just like, I think this is just an assertion. But you can be like, it's as assertive as anything else in debating, insofar as if it is the like granular type of analysis, it's probably as assertive as anything else is. Like, all of debating is assertive, because we're all saying things. So, fair enough. What Adam said about spec, so if you can say something like, if this is about the US, or if this is about the UK, you'd believe me, because, you know, like, this is just something that people commonly know. So you gaslight the judges into thinking that this is something that is commonly known, and often it is actually commonly known, and the judge just ought to have known. Because it is at this point where the judge is like, oh, actually maybe I am really dumb, and I should know this, so this is fair. Yes?
Depending on how specky it is, you can either just actually explain it with structural reasons, which should probably always be your first resort, or you can give structural reasons which are always based in more spec, but if you say them like enough, they'll often be credited. So like for the example of Bangladesh and Pakistan and militarized nations, the structural reasons for that are more spec that they were like previously military superpowers. But if you just like explain it very strongly, most judges are just
exactly. Often the structural reasons for something are just historical reasons, which is just more spec. So yeah, Radan is right. You can just be like, here's some structural reasons for this. But I will go into it about more offensive strategies about how to drop spec. The other thing you can do is be like, I know the AIV might not know this, and this is when you as a speaker, you sound like, you know, more Boy Scouty. You sound more honest and earnest in the debate. And you're like, you know, like this is probably a good thing. But you can be like, but I know you'll be willing to be persuaded, so let me explain this. And then you do what Radan said about like, explaining this back. Eli, you had your hand up.
No,
oh, that's fine, that's fine. Boy Scouts. Fifthly, you can just analogize it to other spec. And this is kind of what Radan said, but not really. So, for example, you drop a technical piece of spec that is maybe relevant to the motion, and then it is like, maybe they won't know this, but they'll know about this other thing that is really, really similar. So let's go back to the last thing I was talking about, which is about Occidental oil in Ecuador. Probably people don't know about this ISDS settlement, but they probably do know about Philip Morris in Australia and Uruguay with the cigarette packaging. This is a very commonly known intuition in debating, especially to do with like countries suing companies and things like that. That actually wasn't ISDS, but it doesn't matter. You can be like, it's really, really similar to this, and you probably know about this, and this is how that played out. So you analogize your spec to better known spec as another way to be defensive. Sixth thing is just to cite your source. Okay, I feel like this isn't the most persuasive thing to do. It's definitely not as good as the other things. However, if you are dropping a piece of spec, it's probably not at much cost to you to be like, I found this out here. And if it is a headline that the judge should have read, then maybe they should have read it.
Yeah, you just say like, this was a headline of The Economist, bro. Like,
exactly. Fantastic. Actual things. Firstly, you want to analogize as far as you can. And this is where you are using your structural reasons, or the reasons behind why the thing happened, to analogize it as to why this happens in every scenario in the motion. Because I do think this is a burden that you guys have if you are doing spec knowledge. So, if it is a more generalist motion, and it isn't the Bangladesh motions we're talking about, maybe you are using, for example, what Eli was saying earlier, an example to get you through that motion to illustrate to the judge all the moving parts to do with that motion within the first place. However, at each step you should at least try and analogize to why it is similar to the motion passing or failing, and why does the thing that's happening. And so yeah, this means like you have to prove its similarity to the scenario that is in the motion. So, for example, here Gov is like, developing countries often restrict tariff and non-tariff barriers to free trade as they want to become rich. And they provide one incentive for this. Then up here is like, empirically this isn't true, and the reason for this is that developing countries have some of the highest corporate tax rates, and they have really high barriers to free trade because they have significant local lobbying to be highly protectionist. And then often local lobbying for protectionism, as we know, overpowers the incentive to speculatively get rich, as we've seen in developed countries when they suddenly lust for protectionism. So think about like the United States now, and how a lot of the Midwestern states are like, actually I really want to be protectionist now. I would say the incentive analysis in the opposition isn't that much more particularly strong than what government said. What they are able to do is, even if it is the case of the first spec claim, which is that they have high corporate tax rate and barriers to free trade, is just competing analysis to what Gov said. What they're able to do is illustrate and use their spec around something that is more commonly known, which is this strange lust for protectionism that does exist in other states. And when this is dominant, that is the point where you get higher barriers as opposed to lower barriers. Notice, I do think OP has more work to do here. Like you should explain like why the lust for protectionism does exist in these developing countries. Again, you're analogizing to your scenario. But I do think just by example and just by illustrating the moving parts, they are just more persuasive than Gus said, even if the incentive analysis is probably somewhat similar. Okay, yeah, but I'm analogizing and telling my panel to believe me, bro, and they just don't believe me. Well, my brother in Christ, you're then just delivering your empirical analysis badly, your shit empirical analysis. So let's look at empirical analysis and how to make it better. I'm just going to give you a few do's and don'ts. So let's judge. The motion is this House prefers a world without literary agents. Assume this is OG and this is a different OG. Just read this and let's be back in a second.
What's a literary agent?
A literary agent, so in the status quo, the majority of Western writers are hired by an agent, and agents often have links to publishers in order to get you published in the first place. And the role of an agency is to read your manuscript and see if you're good enough to get published.
Okay.
So like you don't submit directly to that publishing house essentially.
Yeah. And the agency will give you a contract for your piece. Okay, fantastic. Let's talk. Who thinks that this gov is more persuasive? Fair enough. Who thinks that this gov is more persuasive? I think that both of them are kind of bad. Like, I think both of them are done really, really badly. Let's walk through, Kate, why do you think that one is more persuasive?
I think that that one is lacking in specificity, but the other one goes so far deep into specificity that it feels like they're like throwing spec at you instead of giving actual analysis, whereas on the left, if you don't know who Pegasus or Olympia are, you still know that they're probably publishing bodies and probably universities, so the flow of logic makes more sense.
Yeah. Freya, you had the opposing opinion, right? You had that one.
No, my hands are just on my head.
Oh, you
can
had
say
it?
something
Okay.
if you want.
Hands up again for the other one. Okay, Tom, why do you think that one's better?
No, because it makes you seem knowledgeable, and also it's far harder to disprove as well, because you can just be like, well, bro, it's a fact, like, why are you trying to say this? My analysis isn't true. And I think it's also like fairly intuitive as well. I think the Alex White thing makes it a little bit like, it reduces your impacts definitely, but I think the analysis of that is quite good.
It's also just an easier chain to follow, as in it identifies, here's Pegasus and Olympia, they don't exist, and they don't make up all the market, hence the other things probably still exist, and an easier, just a lot less wordy and more flowy that I think the left side is, as in like, it's just harder for me to process what they're saying than I think the right side is able to do at the same amount of time.
Any other comments? Does anyone want to make another case for this one? Right.
I mean, most of it's pretty bad, but I think the line the line about the capitals such as machine and computers to check books, I think, is the most important line, because on the other side, it's really unclear why market share dissipates. Like that assertion just, I don't think, is real or intuitive.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the market share dissipates because it's just how large the firm is in the market, but that doesn't actually prove any means for publishing firms to continue engaging in this activity, while I think the other side does.
Yep, I think this is reasonable. How do you think it is necessary to name the agencies of Pegasus and Olympia? Necessary, no, but probably what Rodan said about it being clear to follow, maybe yes, because then you have these storytellers or these protagonists in your story that are able to change over the comparative. I do actually think this is easier to follow. I do think the mechanistic work is to what happens on the comparative is what Ryan said. It's probably done better on this side because yes, maybe it is true that they actually, I made this up, they don't have 40% of market share, I don't know. But maybe it is true that they have 40% of market share. But it is unclear how this dissipates, right? So this highlights the importance of, if you have spec knowledge, you do have to explain it on the comparative, often with structural reasons, especially in world building motions or future looking motions. We don't have any spec on that because it hasn't happened. So, you need to be able to analyze this as well as you can. Alex White is not a he, Alex White is a she. So if someone knows this, you probably sound really, really dumb. So if you're going to use your spec and you fear that someone might know about your spec, or ideally I'm a big honesty enthusiast, so be as honest as you can. But if you don't want to be honest, at least if you fear that someone is not going to know. Because then you sound like a bit of an idiot if someone points you out. And if the credibility of one piece of your spec is pointed out by one of the teams, then often implicitly for the judge it's like, maybe they're lying to me. But yeah, I don't think either of these are fantastic. Where are they? There it is. So yeah, just some do's and don'ts. Yeah, make sure your spec is as true as far as you can ensure. This is just something I'm telling you guys because I believe in honesty. But even if you don't believe in honesty, you don't want to believe me on that. Just the other consequence of this is important. Be very specific. So it was sometimes unclear in the second one, I think, that the spec is directed towards something that is important. And though what Rodan said is true, it is illustrative. Sometimes it is more strategic just with spec to be as directed as possible. Thirdly, be relevant, i.e. is this the best path to proof? So for example, maybe you know that this thing has 40% of market share. You read the motion, you're like, I've got a hard on for this and I really want to talk about it. But if it is not conducive to you being able to prove a good point, then there's no point in using it. Like, yeah, maybe you look cool when you say that it has 40% of market share, but you don't look really cool when you say it dissipates into nothing because you haven't explained it. So yeah, don't sound confused and unconvincing, just generally in debating. Right, cool. Let's try a different one. This house believes that credit rating agencies should inflate credit ratings during times of economic crisis. This time we have a gov and we have an op, and they are in the same debate. You guys have had time. Who thinks Gov's winning?
Whoa.
Wait, I haven't even finished reading that, man.
I was going to say, I got through one of them without.
Yeah.
My bad.
I don't get it.
Right. Who's not ready? Okay, sorry. Onion, don't worry. Spoiler alert, it is meant to be convoluted and nonsensical. You're fine. Who thinks Gov's winning? Who thinks Ob is winning? Okay, Gov's winning, sorry, right. Right. But you may ask, but Ob uses more spec and did all the things that you said I would. I illustrated, and then I made it analogous. Yeah, but your spec makes literally no sense, right? Okay, so this would behave like the 2022 cryptocurrency bubble. Like why? Why is it similar to that bubble? Especially when Gov provides non-spec, but fair enough incentive analysis to why bubbles probably don't happen. Bitcoin surged due to insecure and unaudited blockchains and black market Bitcoin mining. Maybe you know what that is. Who the fuck knows what that means? That makes no sense. Like, what the fuck does that mean?
Not in the frame, by the way, so you might want to scooch that way.
Like, what does that mean? Right? Like, and notice this often in debates doesn't happen where you have a nice text in front of you to read. It happens with the Wordans of the world, spitting it really, really fast. It happens with the really fast speakers of the world that really, really want judges to listen faster, but then they say shit like this, and it doesn't make sense. So this means that if you're using spec and using examples, and it is really technical, you really should take the time and the energy just to walk through each of these things. So maybe it is true that this thing would act like the unaudited blockchains and black market Bitcoin mining. but maybe an explanation of what these are, why these things are analogous, things like that. And then, like, the effort to make it analogous is like probably fair, like it's similar to crises because people do speculative things, but you need to make sure that your spec is also as relevant as possible. So how it would respond to all of these and why this would be good. Right.
The reason I went for op was because I actually understood Gov more, and therefore I could see holes in it, and I know how I could rebut to that. In opposition cases, I actually don't really know what I'm talking about. I don't know if they are winning or not. So how would I rebut to that, or am I supposed to say I don't know what they're talking about, so it's probably wrong, so I don't need to rebut to it?
Yeah, I think that's true. Like honestly, so speakers often fall into this fallacy where they assume that the judge is more intelligent than them, so they should do the due diligence to respond to things very, very fully. I do think what Tom said in his remote workshop is important, is that you should try and respond to it in the most charitable way that you can. But honestly, if it's the case that it is very untrackable, you don't know what they're talking about, quite often no one will know what they're talking about, especially if it is like this. And just like, I don't really think about it, but it's like, unaudited blockchains, black market Bitcoin mining are things that just do require an explanation, just like in BP debating. So, you know, like probably you can just be like, you need an explanation for this.
I think you can also just like read the room, because sometimes if people are spitting spec like that, then you can like look around at the other teams and everyone else will look really confused as well as you, and then you just sort of like make a joint pact to like gaslight them to the judges.
Yeah, like honestly, like it's quite effective just to stand up and be like, I don't know what they're yapping about. Yeah. None of that made any sense.
Things that Zainab and I said in the Mace final.
So yeah, don't use shit examples and don't be shit at analysis. You still have to analyze the things that you're talking about. You still have to use examples and you still have to use spec that is targeted. So the purpose of this is maybe you guys are expecting me to be like, use your spec, use it freely and use empirical analysis. And yes, as a judge, I do love some empirical analysis. A lot of you guys will know this. But notably, you still need to use them well. There's still the expectation that they are analyzed. There's still the expectation that they are analyzed to the degree to which the judge is able to buy them. Is your question like how do you analyze them without using structural reasons? No. What is it?
It was just like know your judge basically, and some judges will be very, very happy to see empirical analysis being used, Ryan Lafferty being one of them, but some judges will hate that and oftentimes go out of the way to not credit any spec that you end up saying unless it's explained. So
yeah, sorry guys, know your chair. This is advice you'll get at every workshop, implicitly or explicitly, but it is just true. We tell you guys to do things. Some of your chairs just won't like it. Sorry, but game's game. This is just true. Yeah, the keynote here is your spec is also as good as your characterization. So that is to say that if you're dropping spec knowledge about, especially on a broad motion, so not a technical motion, your characterization as to what those actors did in that specific piece of spec knowledge that you have are the crucial thing to make it as analogous to your scenario as possible. So make sure you, like, irrespective of just dropping a story about spec, you are analyzing each of these characters in the spec and why then the characters in your story are as similar as the story that you're telling. This is, I think, why we had to use a bunch of examples in A-level politics, probably. Lastly, on technical and spec motions, use spec because you need to. And yeah, you can speak, you can probably, so for example, in a spec debate, like the Bangladesh ones that we're talking about, you can probably talk about Jamaat-e-Islami, you can probably talk about the BNP in a way that you would just talk about in any other broad debate about like opposition parties, far-right parties, religious parties, and it will be generally more accepted in the debate, and you probably shouldn't be scared of people being like, that's not true, because it will be like within the debate that people need to clash on these groups, so just so long as you know them, it'll be fine. To know them, like read more. I told you guys I wasn't going to cover that. So yeah, fantastic. We're going to move on to motion prep. Okay.
Yep. Do you want to say goodbye, Aymaan?
Bye. Right.